So who would you say are our heroes today? The people that we admire, that the world admires, that looks up to and says, that's somebody I would like to be like, or I wish I could be like. Maybe they're on a table. And what about you? Who are your heroes? Who do you wish to be like, or who do you hold up as a model to follow or to look to as somebody, as an example to how to live your life and how to set your values? Of course, it really depends on how you define hero. And most commonly defined is the way it's found in Merriam-Webster, and as a person who is admired for courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities, or a person who, in the opinion of others, has heroic qualities or has performed a heroic act and is regarded as a model or ideal. I suspect that not many of us would say that's something we can live up to, or that we would see ourselves living up to, at least in fullness of what it says there. We would not see ourselves as heroes or even potential heroes by those standards. So let me give you another definition. A hero is an ordinary person facing extraordinary circumstances and acting with courage, honor, and self-sacrifice. An ordinary person facing extraordinary circumstances and getting engaged with that in different ways. I think that describes, at least in my understanding, as many of the unsung heroes of today that we can probably think of in our time. I think of having come through the pandemic of about 5 years ago, the unsung heroes were the first attenders, the doctors and the nurses that showed up for work in very dangerous circumstances while the rest of us were isolating ourselves. But maybe the unsung heroes are some of the people that we don't necessarily think of in that context. They were the people who showed up to work in our grocery stores to stock the shelves that we were clearing off and hoarding in our pantries, especially the toilet paper. The unsung heroes were the people who were showing up every day to drive the bus, to get you to work if you still went to work. They were the unsung that showed up every day to get the everyday things done that could not be set aside just because there was a pandemic going on. Well, there are a lot of unsung heroes that have actually been part of Canadian history, and many of them that we probably don't know about. So let me list a few of them. Dr. Frances McGill, known as the doctor who solved murder mysteries. She was key during the Spanish flu epidemic that raged in 1918, and she was a bacteriologist that led a campaign to provide thousands of people with vaccinations against that. But she became perhaps best known as somebody who eventually became a pathologist in Saskatchewan, and because of her experience in pathology, was instrumental in solving and cracking many unsolved cases. Have you heard of Charles Checker Marvin Tompkins? An Indigenous person from a Métis Cree background who served in the World War II as a Cree code talker, a member of a unique military intelligence unit made up of people, of Indigenous servicemen who would transfer messages to the front lines in Cree, where there'd be another Cree code talker who would be able to decipher it and give the information on to the frontline troops, thereby protecting the troops, often being an integral part of getting intelligence out to them in a way that was not understood by others. Heidi Hayoto Shimizu, forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce her name that well. She was a Japanese school teacher. In 1942, the Canadian government expelled her, as well as her family, from their Vancouver home and forced them, with an estimated about 22,000 Japanese Canadians, to live in internment during the World War II. But while there, she used her experience and her skills and her abilities to provide an education for over 2,000 Japanese Canadian children who would otherwise have been fallen behind in the whole school system and their education. But she didn't stop there. when that whole time was over with and she went back in, she was an advocate for Japanese Canadians' right to vote, which was eventually won in 1949, and as well as campaigned for reparations to the damages and the losses that they'd experienced in that time. Have you heard of Q. Doc? Yep, again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Chinese lawyer who in the early 1940s dared to enroll in law school, although individuals of Asian descent at that time were forbidden from practicing law in British Columbia. In fact, they were also denied the right to vote. While he graduated from Toronto's Osgoode Hall in 1945, and he was instrumental in successfully lobbying to strike down the Chinese Immigration Act, a law dating back to more than 2 decades that had prevented Chinese immigrants from entering the country. I dare say probably somebody who you haven't heard of, but whose work on the behalf of the Chinese community may be a compelling reason why you are even here today. But lest you think that the heroes are just people of kind of yesteryear that have long since passed on and are no longer around, I thought I'd bring this person to you, who is also listed on this website as Unsung Canadian Heroes, whose name is Mayan Ziv. She was born with muscular dystrophy, needed to get around in a wheelchair, and was concerned that she could not find out, as she got around, there were places that were inaccessible to her, and it was impossible for her to find out ahead of time what were some places that she could access. She saw a problem and then say somebody should do something about it. She said, what can I do about it? She established a website that was called Access Now. It's an online platform that allows users to see whether a location has ramps, elevators, accessible washrooms, and more. Today, it provides information on 200,000 locations in 35 different countries and helps tens of thousands of users. She says, my goal is to share accessibility information about every single place on the planet. Pretty big goal to have, but she's working towards that. Well, the Bible has its own list of heroes, many of them unsung heroes, in what is sometimes referred to as the Bible's Hall of Faith. It's, of course, chapter 11 of Hebrews that lists a number of heroes of the faith, many of whom we think as giants of the faith, men and women who reached a level of faith and accomplishment that we would think, probably most often think, is unattainable for us, but for whom, if you take a closer look at their lives, were actually very ordinary people, people who faced extraordinary circumstances and felt compelled by God to step out in faith and to get engaged in what was taking place in the world around them. But I doubt if any of them would have considered themselves in any way as heroes. It's the thing about the unsung heroes is most often you hear about these people who step into a situation, a car that's on fire, pulling the people out, doing the heroic things. They don't see themselves as heroes. They simply see themselves as people addressing the situation that somebody needed to do something about. And I doubt whether any of them would have considered themselves in any way this way, not unlike many of whom I would consider as heroes of faith today. And in particular, when I think of those people that I would think that way, the ones that come to mind are the men and women who pastor churches in Cuba, a country I've visited many times, as well as other places around the world, where what they do is not only difficult, and they do it without the vast amount of resources that we have to do church here, but it's also dangerous, and it calls on them to put their lives on line as well as that of their families every day of the week, every day they show up for life. Words of a Leonard Cohen song, I'm a fan of Leonard Cohen, come to mind when I think of them. It's a song called A Bunch of Lonesome and Very Quarrelsome Heroes. You should go listen to it sometime. But in there he says, while I guess that these heroes must always live, they must always live there where you and I have only been. And I think of that every time I make a trip into Cuba, which I will be going here at the end of February with another group to see how we can encourage and support the ministry that's taking place by these men and women who are heroes of faith. They live there. We have only been there. We come in for a week. We don't experience tremendous hardship. We may not have the food that we're used to. You know, if you go to Cuba these days, food is really scarce. They're subject to blackouts. Most residents maybe get 2 or 3, 4 hours of power every day. They don't have the conveniences that we have. A roll of toilet paper costs about the equivalent of what would be a day's wages for them. You don't use that very often when it costs you that much. You wouldn't either. They are the heroes of the faith, but they always live where we come and visit and just spend a week of time. But they would not consider themselves in any kind of idealized way as being heroes either. And I think they might identify with another line from the very same song by Leonard Cohen, where one of the heroes says, "I'd like to tell my story before I turn into gold." Now, the lyrics of most of Cohen's songs are somewhat obscure at the best, and they kind of are left up to you as a listener to interpret what they might mean to you. But what I hear being said here is that this hero in this song would like to be able to tell his story as a very ordinary person before he gets or she gets so idealized or turned into gold that how they live becomes an unattainable, unreachable goal for anybody else. I think the same thing holds true for those mentioned in Hebrews 11. They would not have considered themselves of people of being of great faith. They were and everywhere men and women whose faith was developed and grown through their life experiences and trusting God in the middle of very difficult situations and the adversity that life brought them. It was in a very real way a faith that was forged and hammered out in the furnace of life and the real world in which they lived. And that process, that of forging a real world faith, is really what I want to talk to you about today and in this very short sermon series that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. What it takes to develop that kind of faith, the kind of faith that we need to step out in faith, which is our theme for the year. Following Jesus in the real world where we live most of our lives. But we need to be clear about what we understand about some of the terms within the statement of forging a real world faith. I take the word faith. There are many different kinds of ways of understanding what faith is. For many, and I dare say including Christians, maybe you, it becomes a very passive term that simply refers to what you believe. We have our statements of faith, our creeds that we check off and we believe. They express what we say we believe. Although often we check off the boxes without really processing what we're saying that we believe. And sometimes not even understanding fully because of the religious jargon that some of our creeds express that in. Faith can also be an expression of trust. And see, to some extent, we all live by faith. Did you drive here this week, today? You drove by faith. You drove by faith that other cars on the road were going to observe the laws of the road, that if there was a red light, they were going to stop and let you through on the green light without kind of going through that traffic light and hitting you. We live by faith in our laws, generally speaking, in our lawmakers and our law keepers. We have faith in the laws of our land and a measure of faith in others to follow and enforce those laws. You go to work and you have a certain amount of faith in your employer to actually pay you for work served, work done. You have a faith in your fellow employees to show up and work together with you to accomplish something, to do their part. We have faith in our leaders, faith in others with whom we have significant relationships with. Marriages would not be very successful if there was no measure of trust or faith in there. And we see those things fall apart all the time because of the lack of faith and trust. Friendships fall apart because of that. And faith is only as good as the person that we are trusting, isn't it? But when we come across the word of faith or the various forms of the word of faith in the Bible, it denotes action and not just passively believing something. And I'll come back to this as we go through this. So by the word faith, we have something that means action, that we actively get engaged with something. But by real world, when I say forging a faith in the real world, I'm referring to the world outside the safe and secure confines of our homes and our church. The place where we spend our time throughout our everyday lives, but a place that at least seems very unfriendly to the Christian faith, probably, and at least relatively unaffected in any significant way by our faith, doesn't it? Seems to be relatively unaffected by what we believe as Christians or as followers of Jesus. In fact, if the truth were to be told here, there may be little difference, that distinguishes us from others in that world, in that real world outside there where we work, live, and play. We often share the same values. We share the same goals and ambitions in life. We share the same lifestyle. The question that comes to my mind when I think about those things is, and I think it's a question worth asking, why should others want what we have when the only critical difference between us and them is that we spend 1 or 2 hours in church on a Sunday while they're sleeping in? Some of you would like to have done that today. They're going out for brunch. Some of us will do that on a more delayed fashion. And they're hanging out in the parks, having fun with their friends and family. I'm going to be honest, that when I started getting my life back together and going to church, that was for me a hard thing to give up. I wasn't one who sleep in. I'd just rather stay home and watch the football game on TV. It seemed a whole lot more exciting than sitting through a worship service. I would love to be out playing soccer in the park instead of being inside. So it's a question that comes to my mind as I plan yet one more service and one more sermon. Why should anybody outside the church want what we have? I'll lead you to wrestle with that. But what about the word forge? It can have two different meanings. The first one, not so good, I will admit, that of forging a document or a signature. Something I will confess I became very great at. In my grade 11 and grade 12, I became very good at forging my sister's signature, who was my official guardian. And I would write these notes. I said, please excuse Don's absence from school yesterday, signed Helen Dyck. Very good at that. Now, it's not a practice I recommend if you're young here and you're still in school, because for me, it eventually led to the fact that I dropped out of school. But that's a whole nother story, and you can talk to me about that another time. But another meaning for that word forge, and it's the one I'm intending here today, is the process that a blacksmith undertakes in working with steel. Blacksmith shops are not easy to find these days, are they? Unless you go to a Burnaby Village or perhaps out to Fort Langley. But have you been in one recently? What you would see there is the smithy heating up a piece of steel till it's red hot and almost molten, and it's glowing red. And he puts it on an anvil and he just hammers away on it till he can shape it into something that will serve the purposes for which he intends it to be used for. And see, that's what I think needs to take place in our lives in order to develop what I'm referring to as a real world faith. That is a faith that we don't put on along with our Sunday go to meeting clothes every Sunday to go to church once a week and then take off during the week when we go home and go about our regular lives. But a faith that prompts us to step out and work and engage. Sorry, I lost my place. Engage in life in the real world. A faith that calls us to follow God, the calling of Jesus to be a difference makers in the real world in which way we live 24/7. In his book that I'm choosing, by the same title that I'm choosing for the series, a book written by Gordon MacDonald, he writes that our followers of Jesus need to be absolutely nose to nose with what is going on in the streets. where people live and work. See, we need to develop an awareness of the brokenness of the world we live in and how we can bring our values as followers of Jesus into our everyday lives, making a difference in the world around us without letting it wear us down to the point where we either give up or give in or both. This is the kind of life of faith that these men and women listed in Hebrews 11 were commended for. And it's the kind of faith that we too are called to live by. So what is this faith all about? Well, it's Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. Somebody has said faith is about being certain in spite of the uncertainties of life. Being certain, being confident of what is hoped for. Because our faith is, the foundation of faith isn't what we can do about things, but how God is at work. Now, to be sure, and it's important that we understand this kind of faith doesn't come easy, and nor was it natural to a natural disposition to the people that are listed here. They wasn't a natural part of who they were. It wasn't a faith that they had that was fully developed right from the start. And sometimes that's where we see them, right? We read about Abraham, we read about Moses, we read about all these giants of the faith, and we say, wow, wouldn't it be nice to have that kind of faith? That was not the kind of faith that they started out with. Read their stories. It was a faith that was in every sense of the word forged in the real world through the challenges that they faced as they went through life in their time. And in the same way, our faith has to grow and develop to meet the new challenges that are part of living in our time. Challenges that often come up unexpectedly through a crisis, through some kind of experience that we had not anticipated. Challenges that confront us with a reality that may not fit our way of thinking, the way the world should actually unfold or work out. May not even fit the way we think God should be at work in the world or in our lives, or what he should be doing and how he should be doing it. And in those times, we find ourselves needing to deconstruct and reconstruct our faith and needing to enlarge our understanding of God and being open to how he works in ways we had not entertained before and not restrict him to the box that we had put him in. Listen, I appreciate our children's leaders no end. They try to put the gospel in simple terms of which our kids understand. But your faith as an adult follower of Jesus needs to grow past your Sunday school understanding of what faith is. Your understanding of what it means to follow Jesus needs to grow past your understanding you had when you were 6 years old or 7 years old and attending Sunday school about what that meant. Because if it doesn't, it won't last. It'll be neutralized. If we're to make a difference in the world, our faith needs to be forged and continually shaped and built and rebuilt and reworked as we go through our life experiences. So how does that process take place, you might ask? What does it take to forge a real world faith? And that's what we're going to take up in greater detail over the next few weeks, but I just want to kind of briefly summarize some experiences that we can gain from these people in Hebrews 11, and then we're going to expand on them as over these next few weeks. Forging a real faith begins, first of all, with believing God. Now notice, I did not say believing in God. That's easy. But believing God is a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different experience. Without faith, the writer of Hebrews says, it is impossible to please God because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists. And you first need to believe in God, that he is there. But then he adds, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him, which means that you need to earnestly seek him to be able to come and get to know him and experience him at work in your lives. So it begins with believing not only that God exists, but that he is actively engaged in our lives, drawing us to us, inviting us to actively seek him. Now, I don't know about you. That does not come easy for me. By nature, I am a skeptic. Faith and believing do not come naturally nor easy for me, and I envy those such as my wife Diana, who can have a simple, note I say simple, not simplistic, because her faith is not simplistic, but a simple faith that takes God at his word and believes what she hears from him. I tend to question, if I'm hearing from God, is that really God? I spend a lot of time battling back and forth, questioning, where did that come from? I battle, do you really exist, God? See, in honesty, I wish I could be that way. And not that long ago, as I was driving around wrestling with some of these thoughts, this thought came to me, which I think was from God. And it basically said, Don, would you simply just allow yourself to believe? And I thought, what a novel idea. Allow myself to believe. So here's the paradox of my life that I wrestle with. And I'm telling you this because I suspect some of you would wrestle with the same thing, but because in church we don't often give people permission to wrestle with these things, there's a tension, I believe, in my life at least, between believing God is there and the firm belief that I have that if God is there, he wants to and is able to do these extraordinary things through us, very ordinary people, if we would simply step out in faith. And I believe that with all my heart. As I battle the other parts of my skepticism, I want to give you permission to battle the same things. Listen, doubt and fear are not the enemies of faith. Unbelief is. In fact, if you'd never processed doubts and your fears, your faith never becomes actually real. Part of forging a real world faith is to battle those things and to work those things through in the real life experiences that you and I have. And not just rationalize them away or settle for simplistic biblical pad answers in life. So faith is simply taking that first shaky step, anxious step, to see what God does and if he'll do anything. And it takes me to the second thing I think we can learn here from these men and women of faith, and that is of obedience. Regardless of where your faith is, it's stepping out in obedience. See, forging a world faith takes place as we step out in obedience. 22 times in this chapter, it uses the phrase, by faith. And then it follows up with, by faith, this person did this. And others, they had whatever faith they had, as little as it was, it led them to taking that first step of action. The amount of faith they had may not have been much to see the whole thing through, all the way through, but by faith they took that first step. And so we read that by faith, Abraham, we think of Abraham as giant of faith. By Abraham, when he called to go to a place he would later receive in his heirs, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. I like that kind of mission trip, by the way. Would you go with me on one like that? By the way, here's a good way to step out in faith, take a little baby steps in faith. Go with me to Costa Luz in Mexico. We're putting the team together. We had a meeting yesterday. We have some people already that are anxious in going. Thank you, Jackie. There's returnees that had such a great time, and it was such a good time that they're coming back. You need to come with us. By faith, stepping out in faith means taking that first step without needing to know everything that's going to happen along the way, the full outcome of where that will take you. In fact, God in his grace and mercy doesn't tell you that because you probably would never take the first step if you knew everything that was going to happen along the way. I would not be here today if God had shown me everything that was going to happen when we said, yes, we will follow you into ministry wherever that takes us. But forging real faith also involves growing through our failures. It means trusting God to take care of the details, by the way, along the way, regardless of where it takes us. But it also means not getting it out right every time. It means growing through our failures. We are not going to get it right every time. And all of us will encounter those times when we hold back. I can think of countless times where I said, no, I don't think so. And I learned a lot through those times, through my failures. We learn through those times where we try to do God's work for him when he doesn't seem to show up and at the right time and follow through with doing things the way we think he should do it. And we start getting ahead of ourselves and we start doing God's work for him. Abraham, giant of the faith that he was believed to be, is a case in point. There were several times in the course of his life that he did not take God at his word and trust him. And instead he took matters into his own hands. And you read about it in Genesis, and I'm not going to go into, we don't have time to go into all those things. But the end result was that he made a total mess of his own life and the other lives of others as well. And I dare say that part of the mess that he made back then has lasted up until this time and is part of some of the big issues that we face in the Middle East right now. So we don't have time to go into all those things, but some of the greatest lessons in faith that we will learn come through our failures to trust God and to take him at his word at the time. It's in those times that we come into a fresh and new experience of God and his absolute love and grace in our lives as well. And our relationship inevitably will grow deeper as we process those failures and don't walk away from it and don't pack it in. But more about that in the weeks to come. We'll touch on what it means to grow through our failures and grow in our faith. So the last thing I want to mention here today is that we can learn about what it takes to forge a real world faith from the experience of those who have gone on before us. And that is that it takes the experience of hardship and suffering. Now, I know it's not something you wanted to hear today. You came here to be encouraged, not to have some kind of fear instilled in you. But it is the reality of the life of faith. It is very much a part of our experience in forging a real world faith. You know, for the first part of Hebrews 11, when we read it through, and I take some time later today, read through that whole chapter again, even if you've read it many times before. Read through and reflect on it. But for the first, say, 35 verses, we hear of the fantastic feats and dramatic experience of God at work through these men and women as they stepped out in faith. By the way, when is that we hear testimonies? It's at the other end of things, you know, when God has worked some phenomenal thing. And that's exciting and encouraging. But I know about you, but I've sat there and I've listened to people talk about dramatic things, the way God has showed up in their lives and solved a situation that I was going through, and I'm thinking, how come he's not helping me? So it's not always encouraging to everybody to hear just the dramatic things. I think we need to hear more testimonies or words of experience of where God is not showing up so we can rally around each other, encourage each other, not fix each other. But here, we read through these and we hear about the dramatic things. And who doesn't want to hear about healings and how, you know, the Red Sea is parted and all these dramatic things that take place? Who doesn't want to experience that? But then we get to verse 35. And it's a little bit, I'm going to read some these for you. I didn't put it up on a slide. I just want to read to you, and I want you to listen to what he says, the writer to Hebrews says. He says, there were others, okay? He's listed all these great people. He says, I don't have time to talk about everybody. You know, there's a lot of people I've left out. And he says, and then there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. And I know about this time we want to say, that's not what I signed up for. I'm sure the disciples, when they signed up to follow Jesus, they had a whole different idea of what that was going to mean for them than what it worked out in their real lives. John the Baptist, when he was called and answered the call to prepare the way, he had a whole different idea of what that was going to happen that didn't match what he was experiencing when he was sitting in Herod's dungeon, waiting, a place where he would never get out alive. And that's why he sends his disciples, his followers to Jesus, say, can you just give me this assurance that you are the one we've been waiting for? What he's saying is, I want to know whether this part of my life was really worthwhile. If we knew everything that was ahead, we probably wouldn't sign up. But here's the paradox of forging real world faith. By the time we reach those experiences, it's too late it's too late to pull back. But it's in those times when the heat is turned up in your life, when you feel like you're being absolutely hammered by life, those times when you question God the most, those times when there seems to be absolute silence from heaven and even God seems not to be there with you. It is in those times, here's the paradox of faith, of growing, being your faith being forged in the real life experience of these times. It is in those times, if you choose to hold on, and notice I say choose to hold on and to hang in and simply keep one foot in front of you as you walk by faith, that your faith will grow stronger than ever. And that is because a real world faith always looks beyond today with a vision of a higher calling, a vision that extends beyond our lifetime into a future that we possibly will not live long enough fully to experience ourselves, but are working, preparing the way for others. The chapter 11 finishes by the saying, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what they had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect, they would be made complete, is the word. We are here today because there were heroes of the faith that went on before us that didn't count the cost as not worth being paid, but paid the price. But here's the thing that all of us need to understand. There are successive generations down the road that are waiting for us to pay the price today so that they can experience God to the fullest in their life years from now. Generations that you and I will not live long enough to meet, should the Lord tarry. The author of Hebrews follows up in what we have as the beginning of a new chapter. We have these chapter breaks, and we lose the sense that it's chapter 12, verse 1 is a continuation of everything he's been talking about in chapter 11. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. We have the inspiration of those who have gone on before, and we can become the inspiration of others who are coming behind us, after us. What does it take to be a hero? It takes an ordinary person finding themselves in extraordinary circumstances and counting the cost, but willing to be sacrificial and setting those things aside and be used by God in that moment. Whether or not their name ever gets on any kind of mention, most of these people, they're nameless. Most of the heroes of the faith and the heroes today are the unsung heroes whose name will never show up on on a building, never show up on a street sign. They'll never have a wing of the hospital named after them. In fact, the only people that know about them might be their immediate friends and family. We have an opportunity every day to step out in faith and to be that kind of hero in somebody else's life, whether or not we are recognized that way or they recognize that way. So, are you ready to step into the fire? Are you ready to step out in faith and have your faith forged in the real world of experiences? To develop a faith that isn't a Sunday go to meeting kind of faith, but a faith that is actually of practical results in the real world in which you live and work every day of your life. You study, go whatever you're doing. And it can be in small gestures, it can be something big. But it begins by simply stepping out in faith and obedience to something that God says, here's something. And we'll talk about this as we go along. Something that you notice, that you think, somebody should do something about this. Or sometimes we're asking, why doesn't God do something about this? And I think God is asking us, asking you, why don't you do something about it? Step out in faith, and I'll empower you as you step out in faith. If you sit back and wait to have enough faith to take that first step, do more than take the first step, you'll never do anything. You'll still be sitting here 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Life will be the same, as boring and humdrum as it's always been. But if you want to live an exciting life on the edge, making a difference, step out in faith and let God forge in your life a real faith. Imagine what your life can be like, how you can affect and influence the lives of others.